Welcome to listenN. I'm Brian Gahan, and this podcast focuses on the stories that are buried deep inside all conversations. Be it the kind of conversation you have with someone whose life experience is full of interesting POVs and insights, or the kind of conversation you have inside your own head around your own life experiences. Today, in episode 19, we're celebrating our first year of listenN. We produced 18 episodes this year, touching on a diverse number of topics, each delivered by our unique guests full of passion, soul, and expertise. So in celebration, we thought that we would take a look back, talk about some of the highlights from each episode, share our thoughts, a snippet, and give you a taste of what you can experience from episodes 1 through 18. Connecting words, connecting with the muse, creating poetry. Episode 1 was Susanna Molinolo. Two things that I took away from my conversation with Susanna in episode 1. One of them was the concept of the importance of honoring your desire to be a writer or your wish to be a writer, and honoring that by showing up ready every moment of every day to do just that. Capture thoughts, phrases, words, write them down, mash them over, think them over, and figure out what to do and how to communicate that. And I think that that was such good advice, because most people think, oh, I want to be a writer. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to publish a book and I'm going to put it out there. And so much of the advice I've been given from different creative writers that I've talked with in different episodes, it's all about honoring the process of being a writer. And I thought that was good advice, honoring the fact that you want to be a writer by showing up every day in every moment.
If you tell the universe that you're going to start creating, honor that wish. So I would just say always have something to write it down with. And I don't know, maybe I'm old school, but I do really believe in the power of writing things out. I'm not saying I don't do it on my phone in emergency sort of situations. I've been known to just stop walking on the sidewalk, record in my phone, or type out a little note. But most of the stuff that turns into poetry and that feels good for me has been handwritten.
And then the other thing I thought was interesting was how she uses walking to stimulate her creative process, but she worded it in a way that was, again, I thought very unique, which was that she believes that walking is helping her to bring her writing to another level. So in other words, it's walking that's helping her hone her gift of writing and teaching her what her gifts are. She feels comes to her through the walking process, the connection with nature. And that's something that is a thread that goes through a couple of other episodes, more to do with health and that sort of thing. But there is a actual connection with the creative process and nature that is something that I thought was very valuable in this episode. Before I started to do this episode, I jumped online and I took a look at Susanna's Instagram account. She goes by on Instagram, she goes by @foodplayground, and just how it spelt, just how it sounds, food playground. So I jumped onto her Instagram account and I came across one of her pictures of probably walking about the city. Looks like a morning shot. She's taken a picture of a building with the sun hitting it, and that building happens to be a church. And I believe it's also in an area where there's a lot of homeless people. And she's written this little blurb, and it goes like this. You can be in love with the skyline, crisp, slow, like a first kiss. But downtown has sleepless hearts. Who's going to feed them? Who's going to break their hunger apart? And that's just a small example of why I love that episode, talking with Susanna Molinolo about her writing. So if you have a desire to learn more, check out episode number 1. Being a test in the education system. Initial Teaching Alphabet Survivor, Episode 2, with myself, Brian Gahan. Episode 2 was a little bit of a experiment for me. It was a solo episode where I talked about my early education and some of the challenges that I had with the education system and a thing called ITA, which is Initial Teaching Alphabet. But it was a challenge for me because I'm somebody who I have lots of experiences like we all do, and I have lots of stories like we all do. But I don't always share them, or I don't feel like I am invited to share them. And so that episode was one that sort of challenged that part for me. So I had to step up and I had to tell my story without another person there to help me do that. And in sharing this very personal story, hopefully in a way that helped others understand and maybe helped others on their journey, I came to realize that part of what I say in the opening statement, in the introduction to the podcast is, the stories that we have with other people, or even the stories that are going on inside your own mind. And that was an example. Episode 2 is an example of that for me, which was, that's a story that's been rattling around in my own mind for years and years and years. It'll pop up when I'm out on a run or I'm thinking back about my school days. And I've never shared it. I've never thought to share it. And so the podcast gave me an opportunity to do that. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm very grateful for some of the feedback that I got from listeners about that episode. So I'll probably do a bit more. Bear with me. I've got lots of stories. And I'm one of those people that, like a lot of people, a lot of interesting things have happened to over my lifetime. And I might burden you by sharing some of them with you. So if you get a chance and you'd like to listen to a very short episode about my early education and some of the hurdles that I went through or challenges I went to, check out episode 2. Hula Hooping, Crossing Age and Cultural Boundaries, episode 3 with Amy McCutcheon. I love that conversation because it really opened my eyes to different ways that people can engage in fitness. And I think that there's a lot of pressure for people to stay fit in this world. And there's a lot of pressure for people to go to a traditional gym or a traditional type of working out. And then to kind of come across something like hula hooping and realizing that it's there as an option for you and that it can bring that childlike joy and enthusiasm back into your life at whatever age you're at. I found that to be very enlightening and encouraging. And I also love the fact that, how Amy explains the fact that it's not you, it's the hoop. And if you have the proper weight and the proper size of hula hoop, anybody in a very short period of time can learn how to do it and do it confidently.
Most people think they, and I'm using air quotes here, can't hoop. I don't like that word, but people think that they can't hoop. But really it's because they're using the wrong hoop. And what I mean by the wrong hoop is they're going to the dollar store and they're picking up a hoop that is intended for a child. And not just a child, but a very small child. The ones that they have in, let's say, the dollar store or any of the other big box stores. They tend to be light, very small. And that is not suitable for adults, because when you're bigger, or even like teenagers, people who are taller, the larger the diameter of the hoop, the slower it's going to travel around your body. And the heavier the hoop, the more it's going to dig kind of into your body. And that's when the extra cushioning comes in handy. The heavier and larger the hoop is, the easier it is to hoop. And that is something that people don't quite understand until I give them the hoop and they go, oh my gosh, I can actually hula hoop.
This past summer, I happened to be at a local community event in our neighborhood, and Amy was there, and she was hooping and helping people learn to hoop when a up-and-coming politician came along, and right away, people started to encourage him to try to hula hoop. And his handlers took some people aside and said, listen, like if he fails at this and the press is here, this is going to be devastating to his election campaign. And I thought that was a very interesting sort of snapshot around what Amy was saying about the fact that most of us have some fear and anxiety around hula hooping because we've tried it with the plastic kid-like hoops and we've failed. And so this fear was going through his handlers as well as probably his brain. And they were very nervous and apprehensive to step in front of the television cameras and hula hoop. But Amy convinced him to give it a shot, and he was brave and courageous, and he did. And he was very successful. And so this joyous kind of free-spirited side of him was projected out into the media. And so it just sort of summed up that entire episode for me around how hula hooping can cross cultural barriers, it can cross age barriers, and it can also bring back a sense of joy and childlike wonder and happiness in our lives and add to our fitness routines. Audio producing, a behind-the-scenes look at the magic process. Episode 4 with Edward Zasky. Episode 4 was special for me because Eddie Z, audio producer Eddie Z, audio producer Eddie Z is someone that I have worked with for over 20 years, and he was actually helping me record the introduction to the podcast, and we were chatting like you do in recording sessions about life and career and process and you name it, everything that you can chat about to not get down to doing the work you're there to do. And it dawned on me that he would be somebody that would be a very interesting guest to have on an episode. And he was very, very reluctant. He does not like talking about himself. You'll never get that from the episode because he does talk quite a bit, which is fantastic. But he's your typical human being who's self-conscious about communicating and telling stories about themselves. But I love the episode because he goes into a number of experiences and descriptions on how his creative process works, which is always fascinating to get a behind the scenes look at something like, commercial music production. We all watch commercials. I mean, we see them all the time. There's music, there's audio, there's sound effects. Who does all that? Well, Eddie's one of those people who does all that. And so it was great to listen to him talk about that. But I also love the bit where he talked about Brian May from Queen and how Brian May was his inspiration because he built his own guitars and therefore he was able to create his own unique sound. And then Eddie takes it a little step further and says, you are a unique person, and whatever gear, whatever stuff you have, 85% of what's going to come through the speakers is going to be uniquely you. And that can only be done by you. And I thought that was a huge point for anybody who's starting out or trying to create music or sounds of different types. I thought that was a very interesting point. And then the other thing that Eddie talked about, which I thought was so valuable to anybody who's a creative, especially a freelance creative, because a lot of things that happen for a freelancer are different than happen to sort of people who, work around or in an environment with other people. A freelancer has a tendency to work a lot on their own. Some of them work in their basements, in their garages, or they have an office space, but it's still something that they're doing very much on their own. And so they'll get a brief. And a brief is the description of what is required from them. And usually it's pretty vague and it's pretty all over the place. Like we want it to be fast but slow, but good but bad, or whatever. There's always these contradicting terms. But Eddie refers to it as the suffering.
There's all kinds of ways the job approaches you, or just somebody calls you up and said, "What are you doing right now? Because I got something that has to be done in 3 hours. Can you do this in 3 hours?" In which case, you listen to them very carefully.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, we're not going back, so let's have a quick discussion. Let's see what you need. If you have reference material, it's even better because at least we know you'll be kind of in the area.
Right.
But anyways, the first thing is always the suffering. And the suffering is that after you hang up and you're starting to receive all the intel about the job through email and through links, you're sitting there holding your head going, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Because there's nothing in your head at this point. You don't really know what you're doing. So there's a lot of anxiety about that because you want to have stuff in your mind and you want to be moving forward, but there's always this, it's called I know it's not me. I saw a thing with Hans Zimmer and on a series that he does for Masterclass, and he was talking about it, and I was listening to him going, oh, thank you, Hans. I needed to hear that because like it is real. Like there's this, how am I going to pull this off?
Mm-hmm.
How on earth, and a lot of times you look at it and you go, yeah, it's not really my thing, but I've done stuff like that. And there's no, you're right. Do it. You do it. And you do it. And at the end, you're like, wow, that felt great. But in the initial stages, it can be quite punishing because you got to think about what sounds, sometimes what's going to do the job. Because of deadlines, sometimes you have to, hire a part of an orchestra, not knowing what you're writing, but you have to kind of guess.
Right.
And say,
right.
like, I need 3 violins, I'll need this, or like, and that's where it can get scary. And you also got to book the singer maybe. And you're booking a singer for something that you haven't written, so you have to take in mind key considerations, range considerations. So it is kind of a very squirrely time of the process where you have to kind of assess what it is that you need to do. But then there comes down to the notes.
Right.
And that's another thing completely where you have to say, okay, like, is this going to be a groove thing? Is it going to be a laid back pacing track? Is it full scoring? Like does it starts on a sunny morning and families waking up and the sun flows through the window and everybody's smiling and they're having their crunchies, and then somebody smells something bad and everybody's face goes sour and they all look over at the dog and then it's wah, wah, and then the rock track kicks in and everybody gets in their car and everybody's happy again, whatever. Like you have to address all of these little things, and that can be a lot of work, because it's not just one piece of music that flows along and then kabam, it's over. It has it's growing in different directions, and it's addressing the different characters with their own little themes. It's kind of like working on a movie. Like
Mm-hmm.
in those cases, like you really are scoring it.
It was really interesting to hear that even someone like himself who does nothing but pump out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, he's probably done thousands and thousands of pieces of music over his career, still goes through that moment of just not knowing what to do. And he calls it the suffering, which you just have to work through. And he gives some examples of it, and he talks about some, success stories with it. And anyways, that piece and that word I just thought was great. So if you're into creative processes, you're into music, episode 4 is I think a real gem with somebody who normally isn't out there talking about themselves, but he gave us an opportunity to see inside his world. Storytelling Through the Eyes of a Film and Content Producer, Episode 5, with Jay Ferguson. In Episode 5, I get the chance to sit down with Jay Ferguson, who's a seasoned content creator, a video storytelling, filmmaking content creator. Jay is a very humble, self-effacing, no BS kind of guy. And so he dives into the whole business side of filmmaking, the creative side, the storytelling side. He just dives really deep into his learning, his understanding, how it all came about for him. And so this episode is just packed with information on, the concept of learning to tell a story cinematically, how you can use different aspects of filmmaking to help storytelling. He gives examples of some of his favorites from, Goodfellas, the Coen brothers. I think one of the best things that he said was something, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something along the lines of, you're taking all of this stuff that's made up. It's all kind of fake. Your set, your acting, everything is sort of not really true, but you're trying to create something believable from all of these non-believable pieces to come up with a story that the audience is going to believe is true. And I thought that was a really interesting way to look at it.
This is the thing. It's like, it's all artifice in the end, right? It's like you sit down and you're watching this thing on a box, on a screen, whatever it is, and it's like, it's a bunch of actors saying fake words, and it's, I mean, when you look outside the frame of any filmed project, it's like there's lights and there's crews and there's like people standing there eating, stale baguettes. It's this incredible thing that when it all comes down to what's inside this frame, that there's actually something true going on in there, to me is like, it's almost like impossible. Like every setup is like this huge puzzle to create something real out of stuff that is just, none of it is real. It's as far from real as you can possibly get. And I think that, so in light, where if you can feel the lighting hitting you or hitting your actor, it's going to take the audience out of it. So it's like if I just take a big light and blare it at an actor, and it's this hard, awful light, even audiences who aren't sophisticated are going to go like, that doesn't look natural, and it'll feel fake.
He does talk quite candidly about how difficult the business is, how it's changing, how you have to always be, have a business hat on when it comes to finding your financing and getting your projects made. So he cuts really to the core of why you might want to be involved in this business and how you can decide. And he gives some advice to up and comers with, if the answer is maybe, or I might want to try this, then don't do it. You have to know that this is all that you want to do if you're going to step into the incredibly fulfilling but also challenging world of content creation. Astrology, the New Consciousness, and Being a Modern-Day Way-Shower, Episode 6 with Michelle Pillar. When I came up with the idea of doing this episode, I knew it was going to become an interesting one. I knew by inviting Michelle from Mystic Maps to talk about astrology, it would just blow the door open into a conversation of a lot of different ways that we are coming to understand what's termed the new consciousness. I think when she starts off by saying that she finds it far more fascinating to treat astrology as a tool for self-growth and enlightenment than as a predictive tool, I was like, hallelujah, because that's something that I strongly believe in as well. I mean, the whole predictive side of astrology is where all the holes can be found. I mean, everybody loves to go and read their astrology in the newspaper and then go, oh yeah, today I'm going to have a good day. And that is just so far removed from what astrology can actually do for us when it comes to self-growth and development. And so anyways, I thought it was an interesting opportunity to dive in and talk with her about a number of different things. But again, I love the way she just took us on this journey through the new consciousness, through light having intelligence, through red pilling, the whole concept of people are now asking to be woken up from the illusion of how we have been living and how we have been manifesting on this earth. And is that a pattern that you see happening in this day and age? Is there a growing need for that reconnection to happen?
Oh, yes, it's essential. There's an unstoppable movement around the globe now, and it's a force of mass awakening from a dream. There are people in huge numbers now talking about how this physical life that we live, this is the dream. The real life is not this dream. So in other words, you, Brian, are having, we could take this idea and say, you are having a dream. Your eternal spark is having a dream, is dreaming itself as Brian. And my eternal spark is dreaming itself as Michelle right now. And yet those are personalities. They will come and go. So people around the world are saying, connect me with what is real and eternal. Please disconnect me from my illusions. And so when you start to pull the plug on some of your favorite illusions, and we've all got them, you start to look outside yourself and see some of the illusions that are being perpetuated outside yourself. And you hopefully begin to question, is it real? Is that real? I just heard this story on the news today. Is that real?
Right.
So you hear about people talking about taking the red pill. Did you ever see the movie The Matrix?
Yes. Where Neo has to choose between the red or the blue.
Yeah. And so now we have this terminology that we call, so-and-so just got red pilled, or I just got red pilled. Or, oh, please don't make me have to red pill you. Don't make me have to explain to you what really goes on, those kinds of things. But really, a lot of people are asking to be red pilled, so to speak. Wake me up from the illusion that this is, and show me what is actually the truth. I want to step out of this matrix and into something more freeing and holistic, is what a lot of people are saying.
Michelle describes herself as a way shower and someone who uses astrology, but also angelic Reiki and other ancient tools like crystals and oracle cards to help people navigate the unpredictable times that we're in right now. I mean, I don't think anybody feels grounded. I don't think anybody feels like they know what the truth is. I think everybody is feeling the upheaval that's going on this earth, and we all require at times to sit down and have a conversation with somebody who can show us the meaning behind what is happening in our lives. And that is what Michelle does. Music, mental health, and a survival guide to being a professional freelancer. Episode 7 with Erica Nielsen. My conversation with Erica Nielsen, I thought, was very timely. I mean, we're dealing with mental health and awareness of mental health issues becoming more and more even acceptable to have those conversations, or it's becoming less stigmatized, let's say. We still have a long way to go, but it is improving. And to sit down with someone like Erica, a young woman who is a professional musician, and learning her story behind becoming a professional musician, what that meant to her, how hard she worked at that, and then also to layer in her life experience of dealing with a mental health issue which becomes diagnosed as bipolar, and how that just rockets her world or shakes up her world as a creative professional. I thought was a very, very poignant conversation to have. And I think Erica's way of expressing herself with how her diagnosis impacted her at such a core level is so valuable for others to hear.
Wow. When I was diagnosed with, and they said the words to me, we're about 95% certain that you have bipolar disorder. Without knowing it, I carried stigmas of my own. The images that came to my mind were, vagrant people muttering to themselves on the street. I thought bipolar disorder meant hot and cold moods fluctuating throughout one day. And of course, we know now that it's periods of multiple days to multiple weeks of a mood episode, one way or the other. So I didn't know anything, and I felt humiliated. I was ashamed, like I had a huge secret.
I was frightened of what it would mean for my career as a musician. I was frightened to tell colleagues or tell anybody. I didn't want anybody to know, because any slight against artists in my industry, whether it's an email typo or difficult behavior in whatever way you want to imagine that, can be a mark against you. Your business card is your reputation.
A number of people that, since this episode has gone live, have shared with me how this episode has really helped them with a loved one or with somebody who is questioning the exact same things that Erica was questioning, which was, hey, for example, I'm a hugely successful lawyer and I'm, I can burn the midnight candle and I can work like crazy and it's how I got to where I am. But I'm now starting to learn that I'm, bipolar, or, the other term, manic depressive. And I'm so afraid to give up that manic piece, because that manic piece is what made me who I am. And I think that it's important for stories like this to be out there that let people know that you too can maintain everything that's good in your life while also maintaining good mental health. Let's talk modern day holistic nutrition for you and your kids, episode 8 with Joy McCarthy and Stuart Brown. Episode 8 is just packed with tons of really great information when it comes to diet, health, lifestyle, you name it. And it was one of my favorite episodes because I was able to bring together two sort of powerhouses in holistic nutrition. Joy McCarthy from Joyous Health, a holistic nutritionist, author, blogger, you name it. And Stuart Brown from Genuine Health, a supplement creator, an icon in the industry in Canada. So I got the chance to sit down with them and talk about holistic nutrition, but in a way that sort of, makes it easy to digest, no pun intended. And so, we talk personal stories, we talk how they found their way into these careers and life passions. We talk about phytonutrients and polyphenols and the microbiome and everything that you need to know and understand. Kids' health, kids' nutrition. It's just a really full, if you're going to listen to one thing about holistic nutrition, this is the podcast to listen to. And I'm not, self-promoting it. I'm just saying that it's got a lot of information packed into a very short time commitment. Some of the things they talk about, which I never understood the concept of, is eat a rainbow or the rainbow diet.
Phytonutrients come in the thousands. There's up to 25,000 different known phytonutrients. Phyto means plant, nutrient. So eating more plant foods gives us that nourishment. And when we say eat a rainbow, phytonutrients are what give plant foods their color, their taste, and their texture. So you want to eat a variety of different colors so you get, thousands of different types of phytonutrients. Some phytonutrients act as antioxidants, and antioxidants protect your cells from damage. Some act as, anti-inflammatory agents. And there's thousands of them. So when we eat plant foods and eat lots of colors, we're consuming very nourishing foods.
And that's an example of what I was describing as it's just in layman terms, just easy to understand, easy to communicate, easy to take action on. And all of a sudden you've changed and improved your diet, but you know why you're doing what you're doing. And that's what I loved about this episode. And I loved about my two guests. And I think the best way to sort of sum up this episode is something that Stuart said around the importance of looking after our nutritional health. And I'll leave with that.
And it's just a really nice upward spiral where, you start eating better, you start feeling better, the world starts becoming a safer place, and then it just all sort of goes in that direction, which is really nice.
Traveling the World with a Film and Content Producer, Episode 9 with Jay Ferguson. In Episode 9, I invited back Jay Ferguson, who from Episode 5 was talking about, film and content creation. But in that episode, I learned that he had traveled a ton. And so I wanted to do a separate episode. I wanted to talk to him specifically about traveling to create content and what were some of the pros and the cons. And I think for anybody who has the desire to do that, or needs a little bit of advice in doing that, this is a great episode. I mean, Jay shares sort of this wonderful, magical way that the world opens up to him when he shows up somewhere to film, because as he says, you get like a license to go into places and see things that nobody else would get to see because you're there to film something. And if you've ever watched any of his documentaries or seen some of his shorts or looked at his online content and guidestones, you'll see he gets into some incredible places.
There is this kind of like thing about when you're in the film business that kind of, I don't know what to call it. It's like a pass you get because it's like, oh, you're going to come and film it. And it's like, so we're going to give you access to like the things that nobody else can have access to. I'll give you an example of it. And this isn't exotic in any way, but I remember we were shooting a film here in Toronto, and we needed, like, there was a character who was a senator, and so we needed a senatorial type location. So we went to the city of Toronto and we said, we need, like these sort of hallowed halls of like columns and whatever. And it was like, so we got basically to like go everywhere. Like that was like, we were at Queen's Park, touring around Queen's Park going, okay, well, we could use this hallway, we could use that. And I remember it was amazing because, and this was very early in my career, it was like, we got this like private tour. We were standing in the legislature of Queen's Park looking at it. I mean, we weren't going to shoot in there, but it was kind of like we walked past it and I was like, hey, can we go take, oh yeah, sure, come on in, we'll go take a look. And it was like, suddenly it's like you have access to all these buildings that you as the public can't just walk into and say, I want to go wander around Queen's Park.
One of the places that he got to go to that I thought was like very awe-inspiring was he went to Chernobyl, and he was able to go into the abandoned city and film. And they spent half a day or whatever amount of time they were allowed to there. And, and he talks about it and what it felt like to move around in that space, knowing that people had lived there and they had just left. And, he talks about how trees are growing up inside of houses and things like that. But one of the things that he said, which I thought was just, it just stopped me in my tracks, which was the concept of the sound guy, after they left, said, what was so weird about being there is there was no sound. There was no ambient sound. There were no birds. There was no noise of life. And that just, trickled down my spine, gave me shivers thinking about what that must be like to be somewhere that there is, there's trees, but there's no birds. I just think that it's a great episode because Jay just gets into talking about whether it's filming in France or India or, in the United States and New York City or wherever he's been and all the places he's gone. He just sort of like opens up and shares the pros, the cons, how to do it on budget, how to do it, with a small crew so you can get them into places that you normally can't afford to go to. So anyways, anybody who's into content, anybody who's into creation, anybody who's into storytelling, anybody who's into travel, I think will get a lot out of that episode. Our Brains on Food, the Microbiome, and Nutritional Justice, Episode 10 with Alan C. Logan. In episode 10, well, first and foremost about episode 10, this is a loaded episode. A number of people that I know that have listened to this episode have felt angry at the end of this episode. And it's not because of anything that was done to them. It's more around the amount of information that they get exposed to. And a lot of it has to do with, what's wrong in this world. And so Alan C. Logan comes in to talk about, the only way I can sum it up is sort of like nutritional justice. And he talks about the concepts that are going on from the past, whether it's to do with ultra-processed foods. He tells this fascinating story about Astro Foods in the 60s.
But the Astro Foods story involves politics. It involves jumping through loopholes that basically determine what constitutes breakfast. And the long and the short of it is, Twinkies, the actual company, Continental Bakery at the time, they came up with the bright idea. They saw a loophole in the children's breakfast program, and they knew that if they added soy protein isolate to Twinkies, that they could actually get a product that meets the breakfast criteria for school children in the United States. So this was literally Twinkies with added soy protein isolate, more emulsifiers, more sugar, okay? And, you know, you talk about a quote. They said, we achieve what nature could not do. And they put those cakes into schools, particularly in disadvantaged communities throughout North America. These are children that didn't have options for breakfast. Mm-hmm. And they claimed in the marketing of these Astro Food cakes. So what they did was they renamed the Twinkies Astro Food. And they said it was the equivalent of 4 ounces of orange juice, 2 strips of bacon, an egg, and a piece of buttered toast.
He gets into looking at nutrition, but from a way that it just opened my eyes up. He talks about, nutritional justice. He talks about how in low-income areas, there's more fast food restaurants than in upper-income areas, which means that the people only have access to unhealthy food. He says, one of the things he said was, if you tell people to eat more vegetables, fruits and vegetables, you have to look at whether they're even capable. Like, do they even have a grocery store within, a kilometer or a mile of their home? And a lot of these low-income areas in the United States, they don't. He talks about nutritional psychiatry, where they're starting to learn about, the fact that nutrition has an effect on mental health. There's just so much in this episode. But like I said, you can leave it feeling a little bit angry because, we are in a bit of an uphill battle, but there's hope and there's encouragement. And I think with people like Alan who are out there writing and communicating about this kind of stuff, it's so important for everybody to absorb this information and take away what piece of it will help them. Vintage lover, shop owner, and curator talks mid-century modern. Episode 11 with Sheryl Goods. Episode 11 is a great glimpse behind the junk. And I mean it, I don't mean it that way as in it's junk, but it's like you go by these vintage stores and they're full of stuff, and sometimes you can't really see what's really there in front of you, or it's piled on top of other things. But I get the chance to sit down with Sheryl Goods, who's the owner and curator of a vintage store. And when I say vintage, I don't mean a vintage clothing store, because that's what a lot of vintage stores are. It's a vintage store that's full of furniture, and there is some clothing, but very little of it. It's furniture, it's household products, it's pictures, it's glassware, it's all the stuff that we need to live our lives. And we get a chance to talk about sort of her passion around it, how she became a curator of it. She explains the difference between being a curator and being a hoarder. The hunter isn't just about getting it and hoarding it.
Yeah.
It's about getting it and celebrating it.
That's right. Yeah. Absolutely. I'd say, you hit that on the head. Is that, I could be buying entire estates, or, I could be making those kinds of offers. I'll take all of this, and doing lump sum, but it is more fun to be a curator, and also to be able to speak to those pieces, because people who buy vintage also want to know why this is important, or how do you know, when this was made, or wow, it was made in Canada. So curating helps me sort of treat every piece or every little group of pieces with more care and attention. And again, that just translates to a better experience in the shop of me being able to tell you about how I acquired this.
She talks about the value in some of these products. For example, she highlights the fact that a lot of the wood products that we used in the 50s and 60s are now no longer sustainable. So if you would like to have a piece of teak or oak or something like that, you can still have that without doing harm because you're recycling or you're using something that's vintage. She talks about the concept of plastics and how plastics, when they originated in the 70s, acrylics and plastics and lucite and things like this, they were works of art. They weren't cheap dollar store throwaway. So even we even talk about the evolution of plastics. But one of the things that I loved, she talked to me about the concept of what are called pickers. And pickers are the people that go around and find the stuff left out on people's yards or at garage sales, but they understand that these things have some value, and they'll get them and they'll bring them to a store like hers and say, hey, do you want to buy some of this stuff? And ever since she told me that, I can't, I'm somebody who goes out and runs a fair bit, and I can't run past somebody who's put a box of glassware out on their front yard now without thinking, oh, should I stop and go through that and see if there's a couple of things that Sheryl could use? So anyways, it's a great conversation. It's a heartfelt conversation around beautiful things and about appreciating mid-century modern design. And it was a real pleasure to have the chance to talk to her about all things beautiful when it comes to, furniture and things from the past. Uplifting and inspiring businesses and people to move forward, episode 12 with Richard Picard. In episode 12, I sit down with Richard Picard, and it was a really great conversation because there's a number of things that Richard touched on that I thought were so important to anybody, but specifically people, like myself, who are at an age where they're transitioning in life into something different than they were prior, and they're maybe questioning how they go about doing that. What is of value? What do they bring forward? What do they let go? And Richard does exactly that. He helps people kind of navigate that space. And he talks about a number of things that I thought were really great. So in this episode, I had like 3 big takeaways. The first one was this concept that Richard talks about, that there's a shift that's occurred in business or in the business world, and how society is now more interested in outcomes and outputs as opposed to the appearance of outcomes and outputs. And therefore you can show up in jeans and a t-shirt sometimes because you can deliver, as opposed to in a 3-piece suit looking like you can deliver. And the second thing that he talked about was the concept of keeping track of your accomplishments every week, every day, every month, whatever works for you, but sit and write down. So if you're in a job, write down every week what you accomplished, because if one day you're out of that job and you're looking for a new opportunity, you're not going to remember what you did. You won't remember your accomplishments. And so when you're trying to present yourself to a new opportunity or a new employer or whatever it is, you're not going to have those things top of mind. And one way to do that is to write them down. So I loved his little bit about, take notes as you go along. Remember your accomplishments, so that you can express them in a way that is more true to how they felt at the time that you accomplished them. And the last thing was this whole concept of how we were talking about kindness, and he said, my kindness starts before I speak.
Mm-hmm. That my kindness is not measured in how people perceive their interaction with me, right? But how do I think towards other people? Because it actually influences my action. If I think that person is a complete idiot, my disposition to them will be framed that way. The lens through which I see them will be framed that way, even though I haven't qualified
whether they are
or not.
Yeah.
And so I try to treat people with kindness, and I try to realize that most of us are 1 or 2 steps away from where they are. And if you realize that, whether it's poverty, whether it's loneliness, whatever it is, or even extreme wealth, it doesn't always have to be on the downslope, right? You know, we're sometimes 1 or 2 steps away, just a couple degrees away, meeting that right person, sitting in a coffee shop, and somebody hears a conversation and says, "Hey, I'd love to hire you." We're just a couple degrees away from that next dimension of our life that could be absolutely amazing or the greatest challenge of our life.
Yeah. And I thought that was really such a nice, interesting way to talk about kindness. Like, are you kind in your brain? Like, before you even meet somebody, what are you thinking about them? Are you coming from a place of kindness? Or are you coming from a place of judgment or criticism or fear or superiority, ego, whatever? Are you thinking of them from a kind place before you even open your mouth? And then if you are, then the odds are what comes out of your mouth is going to be kind as well. But I also thought that was just such a great sort of life lesson. From award-winning screenwriter to novelist by way of time travel, episode 13 with guest Alon Mastai. Episode 13 with Alon Mastai, I think, is, again, just packed with great information for anybody who's a creative or a writer. I shouldn't have said or, is a creative, a writer, wanting to learn about creative process, about how to navigate, sort of even just learning the concept of the skill of a craft that would be seen as creative. So Alon is a award-winning screenwriter, but he's also become a novelist. We talk about everything. We talk about screenwriting. We talk about film school. He tells this amazing story about how he met his wife. You have to listen to it because it's just serendipity at its finest. He talks about novel writing and his fascination with sort of sci-fi and about getting science right and, writing a book about time travel. He's one of those people that he's just got a ton of information and he knows how to communicate it, which all great writers can do. So anyways, if you haven't listened to it, take a listen because I think it's got lots of information for people that are trying to do anything outside of the norm. Some of the takeaways I got from my conversation with Alon, that there was this one little great thing where he was like, don't fail before you've even tried. And I think that with a lot of people that are trying to do something creative, they get inside their own head and they start to look for the obstacles for why they can't do something and they haven't even tried. And so he just says, like, don't you be the obstacle. One of the things that he talked about was this concept of the accident of people. And it all stemmed from this conversation that we were having from his novel, All Our Wrong Todays, where he talks about the accident of technology. Like, for example, the car crash or the car accident was created because the car was invented. So when we invent technology, we don't necessarily think about the things that we're creating because of that technology that have never existed, like a plane crash when a plane gets invented. But then he flips that into the concept of the accident of people.
But they go into these things with positive intentions, and life has a way of making things a lot more complicated. And so I think that there's a responsibility to think about this stuff. As a storyteller, it's very rich. I love thinking about not just the accident of technology, but the accident of people. Every person you meet has unintended consequences on your life. And they may be very, very minor, or they may be very, very major. And so when you take that idea of the accident and you apply it not just to technology, but also to people, then you start to get into the stuff that makes storytelling worth doing.
And I thought that was so great. I mean, I just thought that was so deep and interesting to think about, because it got me to reflect on my life and some of the things that have happened in my life around moments where I actually have been the person who have been involved in somebody else's life, if you know where I'm going with this. And it took me back to when I was in Ethiopia. I spent some time over the Christmas holiday and New Year doing photography. I was in an aid hospital, and I got told that I could take photographs in the operating room on Christmas morning. They were doing some operations and I could take photographs. So I went into the operating room, which was of course very makeshift, and it was clean and it was healthy, but it was in an aid camp. This young woman had a cyst that made it look like she was 9 months pregnant. And they cut her open, her stomach, and they took out what was the size of a basketball cyst, put it in this sort of stainless steel bowl. I took photographs the whole time, and I was just in awe of what these doctors had just done and how this person had this thing inside them that was so huge. And later that day, I was interacting with the operating room nurse, and she kind of made some sort of comment about the fact that, yeah, they didn't need to do that. And I was like, what do you mean they didn't need to do that? And she said, well, they did that for you. And I was like, what do you mean? She goes, well, normally when they remove something like that, they do a small incision, they go in, they pop it, and they pull it out. But they took the entire thing out because they wanted to impress you. And I was just devastated because I was like, because I was there, this poor woman now has a scar from her, I don't know, like right up her belly, right? Like as big as it could be. She's been scarred. Yes, her life's been saved, but she's been scarred all because I was there. And, the very next day, I'm been invited into an examination room to take photographs of a newborn baby and the mother who have come in because the baby is sick. And you have to understand, this is in a remote area of Ethiopia. So most of these people that are coming to this hospital are tribes people. They're the Afar tribe. They're people that, they don't live in what we would understand as like villages or towns. They live in the desert and they move around. And so, they've maybe walked, 3-4 days a week to get to this hospital. And so this woman's got a sick child and she's there, and I'm taking pictures, and the doctor's totally comfortable with it. And I'm taking pictures of him examining the baby, etc. And in the corner of the room is her husband, and he's sitting there, and I can pick up that he's a bit nervous maybe, but I don't pick up anything other than that. And anyways, later that afternoon, not later that afternoon, like maybe, 45 minutes later, I'm out walking across the compound to go back to the house that I'm staying in. And this woman's husband approaches me in the middle of the sort of square area, and he has a gun in his hand and he's pointing it at me, and he's like red in the face and he's upset and he's wanting to know why I was there. And I don't understand that. What happened is some other people came in to help translate for me, but this is what was the issue. And he was enraged that I had been there taking pictures of his wife and his newborn child. And even though I had been allowed to by the medical establishment there, I was looking down the barrel of a gun pointing at me, and this man was wanting something. And luckily for me, through maybe the expression on my face and my gestures and through the interpreter, we were able to diffuse the situation. But again, it was like one of those moments of like, by me being there doing what I was doing, there was this interaction that unfolded. And again, like in a matter of 48 hours, I'd had these two experiences that really went to the core of what was I doing there? Why was I there? Was this purely a humanitarian thing? Was there some ego involved in it for me? Should have I handled it differently? And then the third thing that happened within about 72 hours of all of this is, and if you've never been into sort of, we call it the developing world, but I don't think that's the right word. But if you've ever been into an area of real poverty, you can imagine, you'll be able to visualize maybe what I'm talking about. And if you haven't been, then just bear with me. But I'm in a, quote, taxi type thing, car, vehicle in downtown Addis Ababa. And it's night and it's raining, and he's taking me kind of through this sort of side street area. So we're not even the main streets there were like, dirt and potholed and etc. So anyways, we get to this place where the car has to stop, and it's going over this little bit of a river, and all of these little tiny kids come climbing up out of the sort of well of the river, or the bridge of the river, and they're begging at the car. And my window's slightly open because it's raining and the windows are steaming up, etc. And so I sort of look at these kids, and these kids are like, I'm talking like 2, 3, 4 years old. Like, I'm not talking, like teenage kids. I'm talking like small children, and they're begging for money. And I have what's the equivalent of let's say 25 cents, but I have a 5 beer, which is their currency bill, sitting, and I go to reach for it, and the taxi driver starts to drive, and the kid saw me start to reach for it, so he just hangs onto the car, and I'm screaming at the taxi driver to stop. He's ignoring me. He's driving. The kids fall from the car. God knows what happened to them, whether they went under the wheels. I have no idea, because it was so dark and it was so rainy. But I just looked at the taxi driver and I was like, how could you do that? And he said, oh, they're just drug addicts. And my heart just sunk. And I thought, I just created that. Like, by my reaching for the money, I signaled to these kids I was going to give it to them, and they hung on for dear life to try and get that money. And this guy could care less about them, because that was the society or the culture that he was coming from, and he just drove off. And I had no way of stopping or fixing what I had started. So those were my, like, in a matter of like 72 hours, I had these 3 occurrences that made me sort of very, very conscious and aware of the fact that I had an impact with what I did, where I went, my gestures, how I interacted with people. And it all was extremely eye-opening. And when, I'm going to bring this full circle back to what Alon was sharing, which was the fact that, there's the accident of people, meaning like every person you interact with, you have an unintentional consequence on their life as they do on yours. So anyways, I know that's kind of a sidetrack, but anyways, it's the episode in itself is fantastic. Alon's a very wise, seasoned writer who's a very talented man, and I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll enjoy his book. I think you'll enjoy his movies. I think you'll enjoy what he's working on right now. So check it out, and maybe you will walk away with some sort of life lesson like I did. Devin Cuddy, singer, songwriter, and musical genre blender, episode 14. There's nothing that I respect more than extremely talented people who are humble. I find them intriguing, I find them inspiring, and I also find them to be surprising in this day and age of whether it's social media or just the look at me world. To come across people who are grounded and humble is a real pleasure for me. And in episode 14, when I sit down to talk with Devin Cuddy, that's exactly what I got exposed to. A young musician who has had the fortunate opportunity to come from a, iconic musical family, but also has been humble enough and creative enough to navigate his own way through his own musical styles, through his own favorite musical genres, to find his own voice and come out and perform with his father's band, but also on his own. And he talks everything from, you know, how he writes his music to what it's like to need or come to that point in life where you're looking for collaborators in your creative process. He talks about songwriting. He talks about his lyrics. Anyways, I just found it to be a great conversation. I hope you'll enjoy it too. Episode 14 with Devin Cuddy.
When I was young, my eyes shone bright. I couldn't wait to get beneath those lights. So I sat still, waited for so long. The lure of fame, how it burns so strong now, and I don't wanna be on the radio. No, I don't wanna be on the radio no more. No, and I don't wanna be on the radio. No, I don't wanna be on the radio no more. So I took my heart and all it left.
A Step into Astrology, A Fallout of Reality, Episode 15 with Michelle Pillar. In episode 15, I invited Michelle Pillar from Mystic Maps back to have a conversation, because the conversation that we had back in episode 6, I felt was kind of broad. It wasn't so focused on astrology. It branched out into a lot of different areas. And so I invited her back and I said, hey, I'd just like to do like an astrology 101 for people. Like, you know, if people are kind of curious or they've dabbled, but they've never really dove kind of a little more under the surface of astrology, let's just sit down and do something like that. And so she says to me, okay, you know, let me talk about the moon and the phases of the moon. So I thought, great, this is perfect. But like all things Michelle, there's just so much information packed into who she is. She can't help but just take things and run with them. So we started out talking about moon hacks, which were great. If you haven't heard it, take a listen, because I do think it's a fantastic way to focus us. Whether you believe in the full moon or the new moon or you don't, it's just a way and a cycle to help focus us on manifesting what we're trying to do in this world. So it's great for that. But then Michelle takes this crazy left turn and kind of throws the lid off of everything and goes, but here's the other stuff that's going on out there. Here's what some people are saying about the moon. For example, it's not really real. Anyways, you have to listen to the episode to go into that.
And we know that living in the digital age, we've got access to as much disinformation as we do valid information.
Right.
And it makes our job as humans really challenging to suss out what we can actually rely on and what we need to discard. And it's no different in the spiritual seeking community. It's very complicated.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you want to share, if you would like me to share with you some of the odd things that I've been encountering in my reading.
Now, when you're saying the odd things, you mean like things that are contradicting each other, or
yes?
Okay, so yeah, please share away. It's fascinating. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that I love, because I love to sort of look at everything. I don't want to look at just the information that feels comfortable to me or is 100% scientifically proven by fact. I like to look at the information to go, where could this be going? How could this evolve our science and evolve our human knowledge to the point where we start to understand these things. And so, you've got people like NASA and you've got NASA that are looking at gravity and whether gravity is something that we can actually escape from. This kind of stuff I find fascinating. And so anyways, this conversation with Michelle absolutely takes us and blows our reality apart. So if you have a chance, listen to episode 15. Chasing Dr. Robert Vernon Spears Through Our Post-Truth World, episode 16, with Alan C. Logan. In episode 16, I invited back author Alan C. Logan, who is a naturopath, a researcher, and also a social commentator, to talk about his new book, Self-Styled, Chasing Dr. Robert Vernon Spears. And the episode is quite fascinating because he goes through how he even uncovered this character. And I mean, this is a true life story. So this actually happened. And he talks about how he was investigating, or he was trying to figure out what was happening with naturopathic practices in the 60s. Like, why did they go off the radar in the United States? And in doing that, he stumbled across this character, this con man who was a naturopath at that time, who was involved in all sorts of confidence tricks and forgery and underground abortion clinics and you name it. But anyways, the book is a page turner. You just can't believe that these kind of things happen. And the truth of the matter is, in this post-truth world that we live in, we do now have a fascination with con men. We're curious, like, how do they operate? How do they get away with it? How do they convince us that what we see isn't really what's going on, or what we see is not the truth?
We do need to understand how it is that these con men get into tremendous positions of power. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a national, guild of alternative medicine, or, whether it's someone that's looking to become, the leader of a nation. We need to understand critical appraisal. And this is sort of bringing me back now to what the original quest was and the discovery of the Spears stories. A critical appraisal, I think, has become so important. And that's why I think there's a tremendous craving for stories of con men, these true stories that are emerging now, because I think individuals and groups really understand, sort of what's on the line today. And we're living in this so-called post-truth world.
In this episode, you learn a little bit. You learn a little bit about the story, and hopefully enough to intrigue you to go out and buy the book and read it, because I do think it's well worth reading, because it's based in the 60s, and it just blows your mind what these characters were capable of doing. And to this day, I'm always fascinated by them, like how you can even sleep at night when you have so many lies out there. But anyways, it's a great episode, but it's also a great book. So that's episode 16. Mindfulness, Meditation, Creative Writing, and the Art of Coming Home, episode 17, with Dr. Ranjini George. Episode 17 is one that, it's kind of like an extension of episode 1. Episode 1 was Susanna Molinolo around creative process and writing. And then episode 13, episode 13 with Alon Mastai around creative writing. And then episode 17 with mindfulness, meditation, creative writing, and the art of coming home, to me, is kind of the icing on the cake when it comes to writing and the creative process, because it brings spirituality into it. It brings the practice of meditation and mindfulness into your creative process. And one of the real nuggets in this episode is that Ranjini takes us through a mindfulness exercise, which for me was just a really lovely moment to see, one, how simple it is, and two, how it makes you feel afterwards. If I had to sum up this episode, I think I would do it in Ranjini's words, where she says that, writing can be an emotionally destabilizing process. And part of that She quotes Natalie Goldberg's book, Writing Down the Bones, when Natalie says that writers have to live twice, specifically memoir writers. But if you're writing about anything, you're reliving that emotional experience again. And that can be very emotionally destabilizing. And meditation is known to be a stabilizing force. So that's why the two of them in tandem is so important to the creative process of somebody who's trying to become a writer. So Ranjini offers up some advice to somebody who is new to meditation and mindfulness, and she talks about the concept of journaling, because she says that journaling, just like meditation, takes us home to ourselves. It makes us think and it takes us inward. So journaling, which is something that a lot of writers will do, is a great way to start to practice mindfulness.
And with the mindfulness, I mean, I think, with the meditation practice is just a way of going home. It's just a way of actually learning to be friends with yourself, to listen to yourself. And in a way, that's what you're doing in a journal. You're listening to yourself. You're awake to the world. You may hear the sound of geese. You might see the sun rise outside your window. So you're awake to the world. You're awake to the radical grace of being alive.
And I love this quote about journaling from Ranjini, where she says, journaling is a multifaceted practice because it is sacred, and on a practical level, it keeps us in touch with words. It helps us learn how to listen to ourselves. What great advice. So get out there, journal, learn some mindfulness, and let your creative process soar. Reinventing the Urban Garden, Episode 18 with Lorraine Johnson. Episode 18, Reinventing the Urban Garden with Lorraine Johnson, is one of my favorites because Lorraine is such a soulful person that I sat down to talk to her about native plants and how we can take our urban spaces and make them beautiful, but also make them very functional for environmental reasons, whether it's for bees, pollinators, insects, you name it. And in the episode, she started to talk about her connection with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how it had asked all of us to look at our treaty responsibilities on how our work affects them.
I'm actually in the midst of really rethinking the definition of native plants that I have certainly been a part of putting out there into the world, certainly in Canada, and saying, hey, so for a long time, I talked about native plants as plants that existed in an area prior to European settlement.
Mm-hmm.
And because I've been on this journey, a personal journey since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came out, and really trying to build relationship, and trying to, as a non-Indigenous person, to try to think about, my treaty responsibilities, all of these things, and really build relationship with Indigenous people and peoples, and then to think about what it is I do in my own practice, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the calls to action, called on everyone, and particularly on non-Indigenous people, to think about how these issues connect with their work. So I write about landscape, I write about gardens. So that reflection, that period of thinking, wow, I write about native plants and I have never connected with Indigenous knowledge keepers or read books written by Indigenous people about native plants. Anyway, so thinking about this, I realized, okay, the thing about the definition of native plants that myself and others have used forever. A native plant is a plant that existed in an area prior to European settlement.
Because it's about us.
Yeah.
Like it's always about, there's before us and after us.
Exactly. And it completely negates, ignores, erases Indigenous agency on the land.
And that just opened up a conversation around, our urban spaces, what we're doing, planting urban plants, how we, bylaw bully people into having green lawns. I mean, the conversation just became so much more than, hey, tell me about native plants. So if you're into gardening, into the environment, or just want to learn a heck of a lot about the choices that we make and the impact they have to make a positive impact in our environment and in our urban spaces, listen to episode 18. And with that, we come to an end of our first year of episodes. A huge shout out of gratitude for our guests who took time out of their very busy lives to sit with me and have these conversations, as well as to our listeners for their support and feedback. Please remember, if you haven't, head over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review this podcast. It really helps others find listenN in the overwhelming pool of podcasts that we all try to navigate through. And also, please follow us on Instagram and or Twitter at listenN Pod. That's listen with 2 N's pod. Or check out our website at listennpod.com. Again, listen with 2 N's pod.com. Thanks for listening and enjoy all your conversations.